So what is this return value I'm talking of? Well, let's say I change this here to not print something out, but instead I want to return a string. And this is a common scheme because oftentimes your functions will just do something and return a value for the caller of the function to use. I can return a value by adding the return keyword. So now I'm just returning a string. This is no variable assigned to a string or anything, it's just a string. So I'm returning this string here, and then I'm assigning this returned value to another function, which now isn't a function, so maybe I should name it returned to make this less confusing. So returned is now what this function, calc, returns, which again is this string. So now if I print returned, what do you think we'll see? Well, of course we see inside function, because now I'm printing what this function returned to me, which is this string. Of course I could also return a variable defined inside calc. So return string var. What do you think we'll see now? We still get inside function because I haven't really changed anything. I'm just using a variable inside this function, which is perfectly fine, and I may do that. Now there is something special about the scope of this variable, but I'll come back to this in one of the next lessons. So I'm now returning stuff inside this function, and that's cool. But sometimes I also want to pass something into a function and not just return values. I can do this by adding arguments here between the parentheses in my function definition. So maybe, since this function is called calc, I want to calculate something. So I'll pass two numbers, let's say, number 1 and number 2. Now here I'm not assigning any string variable, but instead I want to return, let's say, the addition of number 1 and number 2. And this is just the addition operator here, of course. So now, if I execute this, what do you think we'll see? Well, this might not have been straightforward, but we get not a number. The reason is we're still calling this function without passing any arguments here, right? But we try to add the arguments we get and we return the result. Now, we did not get an error, which would be the case in some other languages, because we're calling a function which expects arguments by not passing arguments. But what gets passed indirectly are two undefined numbers. So technically we were adding undefined plus undefined, which will, since we're doing a mathematical operation here, result in an error and return not a number, because we can't add undefined and undefined. Therefore, we are returning this result, which is not a number, and then we're printing it. This is why we see not a number here. So to make this function call here more useful and not get not a number, I will add arguments to it, let's say 10 and 8. And I do this by simply specifying them here when I call the function separated with commas. If I now run this, what do you think we'll see? Well, we get 18 because we're adding 10 and 8 inside this function and returning the value, which we then print here. So now this works. What happens if I pass too many arguments? So if I pass one extra 10 here, what do you think we'll see now? Well, we still get 18 and the other argument is just ignored. We don't get an error like we would get in other languages, but it's not getting used either. And now what do you think happens if I change this a bit, and here I create my variable named calculator and assign this to this calc function, but I'm not executing the function here. And then I log out calculator 15 and 2. What do you think we'll now get in the console here? Well, we get 17, because what I'm doing here is I'm just assigning this function here to a new variable. So this variable is now also pointing to this function. And then I'm executing this function and I pass 2 arguments. And therefore I get back the addition of the 2 arguments since I'm simply just executing this function here. So that were the basics about functions and how you can use functions. Now, why would you use such functions? Well, as you already saw, functions allow you to enclose some code, and you can of course call functions more than once. Therefore, it's a useful utility for repetitive tasks or more complex calculations or code you don't want to execute right at startup. Because remember, generally, all your code will be executed once the browser runs through it.